But Justin Williams joins us now. Justin, you were at the Big 12 meetings last week, and revenue growth was the topic. I thought it was funny that so many people reacted with Brett Yormark saying open for business. Oh, who's he going to get? But then, later on, I believe it was you that asked him about that in particular, where he's like, no. I wasn't talking about expansion. I was talking about like actual business.
Yeah, he did. He did bring up the open for business line once again, and you are correct. So it wasn't me. Someone else asked, "Oh, does that mean you're, purposely pursuing expansion opportunities?" And Yormark assured all of us there in attendance that was not the case. He was not looking to add new schools. I don't think you can ever take that off the table anymore in college sports. But I think he was just trying to reiterate that for the Big 12, he's all about growth and maximizing revenues. That was a term you heard a lot if you were talking to people who were at those meetings last week. And then he even talked about on Friday, I think he called it value creation, was kind of the main priority for the conference going forward. So I think open for business, at least now for Brett Yormark, means what it, maybe its most literal interpretation as opposed to the expansion realignment that it kind of became to reference earlier.
When we talked to him at the Big 12 Pro Day at the Star at the end of March, he's bullish on their growth and the way that they're doubling down on some things and, trying to find more growth avenues for basketball. And, but the, Mac Rhodes told us, just a couple weeks ago that the focus has to be on football and everybody being good in football, competitive in football, winning, getting in the college football playoff, winning in the college football playoff, and so on. What can they do to ensure that they are competitive with that? Because it was a little bit vague to me, his answers on, well, how do you keep pace with the SEC and Big Ten, given that now you have revenue sharing and all this other stuff coming down the line?
Yeah, he didn't necessarily give a bunch of specifics on that front either. One thing he did say that was interesting is, he talked about the Big 12 put forward this new vision statement, and it was to be the most relevant conference, in college sports. And so we brought up the fact of all right, Big Ten, SEC, there's clearly a financial gap there, right? And his point was relevance doesn't always equal money. I think most of us would argue it tends to. It certainly seems to right now the way the Big Ten and the SEC are kind of functioning. But I think his point was that just because those schools might be making more money from their revenue deals from the CFP, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to be more relevant. And I think part of that, which he brought up, and Linda Livingstone, the president of Baylor, who's the chief of the board, they talked about the potential parity and competitiveness, specifically from football, that the Big 12 is kind of looking at this year. And we've talked about this, and I've heard about this, and a lot of people have. It could be a really deep conference and a very competitive conference race. And I think they're going to try and push that a lot in terms of, yeah, maybe the SEC and Big Ten have these teams at the top, but then there's so many other teams that just seem to not even have a chance before the year even begins. I think the Big 12 is really going to lean into being the most competitive and parity-fueled conference. Now, how does that translate to dollars? I'm not totally sure. I think they kind of view as like, all right, if we can position the Big 12 as this type of conference, and then we can kind of double down on that from a narrative and marketing perspective, all we're going to see is any avenue to revenue, whether that's localized on campus for universities in terms of sponsorships or branding or whatever they can do, or if it's just the Big 12 at large as a conference, whether that means basketball, whether that's the Big 12 Mexico, whether that's just finding little things like the Pro Day where they can kind of keep the Big 12 front of mind or try and push a separate event. I think they're really going to lean into that. And these are all things that, Brett Yormark's very familiar with from his past in NASCAR and the NBA and Rock Nation and things like that. So I think you're seeing him really lean into those things that he's very comfortable with.
He also was not too shy about, there's a lot of pearl clutching about private equity or private capital. He didn't seem to rule that out or say, he said it was kind of a good thing and a compliment. Now, he didn't say definitely that the Big 12 should do it or would do it, but he did not slam the door in any way or say anything negative about it.
No, and this was what I thought was one of the more interesting things about his comments on Friday is, he talked about that private equity being interested in college sports. He seems that as like a validation of the value of college sports and kind of the direction it's going from a financial, economical, cultural model. And yeah, he didn't give any specifics, but he said, I don't view the interest from private equity as a bad thing, which is interesting to juxtapose with, earlier that week, Greg Sankey at SEC spring meetings gets up on a podium and compares it to Red Lobster and talks about, we don't want the same thing that happened in some of these private equity businesses to happen to college sports. Brett Yormark going the other direction. I think it's, part of that, again, as we talked about, how is the Big 12 going to narrow that gap between the SEC and the Big 12? Well, there's a, potential avenue right there, and he certainly didn't shut it down. But he also talked about, again, he worked in the NBA and private equity has gotten involved there. I think he's worked in other areas of business that private equity has gotten involved. Look, there are tons of horror stories and there's tons of trepidation out there about private equity and what that means if college sports gets into that. But I did think it was interesting that when he had a chance to kind of shut it down or even just say, that's not something we're looking at or focused on, while he didn't lay out specifics, he certainly didn't run and hide from it. And that was kind of telling, I thought.
But yeah,
sorry about that.
Yeah, Justin, I think here's the other thing to kind of follow up on. You broke up a little bit in that, but to kind of follow up on the private equity question, I don't know this for a fact, but I would assume that some of the schools that Redbird has met with secretly live in the Big 12, and that some of those schools, after meeting with Redbird, have gone out and said, called Brett Yormark and go, hey, what do you think about this? So him shutting the door on it would probably be counterproductive to what the Big 12 is trying to accomplish, at least, capital-wise. And, if he's got, of the 16 teams, if 7 of them have called him, he's got to navigate that however he has to navigate it.
Yeah, and look, he was very upfront in terms of we have to search out every possible avenue, every possible, availability for us to increase revenues as a conference. And so I think that's an example of, even if he's not coming out and saying, yeah, these schools are doing it, or we as a conference are doing it, or anything like that, he doesn't want to seem to shut that door to any possibility. And so I think you're right. I think that was one of the more telling things of his comments was there's been a lot of, news and concern about this out there. And while we haven't had anybody, completely jump into that ring yet, the commissioner, who's really pushing value growth and revenue growth, kind of gave a response that, hey, maybe this would be something that we shouldn't shy away from.
Yeah, I'm curious to see where that goes. Now, we've talked enough about the legal and all these things and revenue wise. Let's talk about some actual ball as it comes up here, Justin. This is a league in the Big 12 that should be, when it talks about being relevant, there's not going to be a more competitive league in the country this year, I would think. I would think it might even mirror last year, the top of the Pac-12 last year that was so good.
Yeah, and that was something Brett Yormark talked about. That was something Linda Livingstone talked about on Friday, which was they're really going to lead into this idea that this is the most competitive, power conference certainly in America right now. And I think that's reflected in things like the Vegas win totals, or also just kind of the general tone of programs. I did a power rankings on the Big 12 that we talked about a couple weeks ago. I think you could easily make the case for 8 teams to kind of be in the mix. You could probably, on an optimistic side, extend that to a couple more schools. And so that's going to be, I think you're going to see a lot of that kind of messaging and tone around the Big 12. And look, that's genuine. I think there's the Big 10 has some really exciting teams. The SEC is always going to have teams that are in the mix for the national championship, but at the bottom of the conference, sometimes even the bottom half of the conference, there's a lot of teams that aren't really going to have a chance even entering the season. And for the Big 12, I don't think the conference feels that way. I don't think a lot of the teams feel that way. And so if you're kind of setting up the excitement with a 12-team playoff format and a couple teams having a chance to get in, I think that's something that maybe the Big 12, they don't necessarily have a ton of advantages over the Big 10 and the SEC right now, but I think that could be one of them.
Yeah, they're probably not getting, for them to get 3 teams in, they'd have to have 3 teams that 2 of which didn't play each other in the championship, and an 11-1 and a 12-0 and 11-1 and a 10-2, which is more likely to happen than it ever has with 16 teams. But they're not getting 3 in. But if they do play their cards right, there is a shot that they could get 2 in, even with the Big 10 and SEC trying to block out as many people as they can.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned with that 16 team, there's going to be teams at the top of the standings that don't play each other. And so tiebreakers are going to come into play. And you could have a team that, maybe doesn't get a chance to play in the championship game, But if if they play really well and have one or two losses and get boxed out, and some things fall their way, and in terms of the rankings, they could be right there in the mix for that 12. So you're right. Getting 3 or 4 teams is probably unrealistic for the most part. But with the way, kind of just the whole field has shifted in terms of power conferences and the way this playoff format sets up, there's going to be a couple teams, when you get into October and the title race starts to heat up, that are going to feel like they have a chance not only for a conference championship, but to get to the playoffs.
I'm curious your opinion before we let you go on Greg Sankey last week. He threw out, and it's something I'm going to call it every time I hear it, when they were talking about the employment question. And he said not one single college athlete has come up to him and said, I would like to be taxed like an employee. Well, I mean, yeah, but nobody wants to be taxed like an employee. I don't want to be taxed at all, but it's the price I have to pay for being an American citizen and having a job. Like, that's just how it works. Like, I don't really buy the excuse of like, oh man, these kids are going to hate paying taxes. Well, I'd rather pay taxes on $750,000 than not have $750,000, if that's what your point is.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to juxtapose, just as with the private equity comments, like, Brett Yormark and Greg Sankey. He came up through the college ranks. He's, a power conference commissioner that's been around for a while. Brett Yormark, which the industry seems to be kind of drifting this direction, right, which is hiring the media executives and the moguls who have more of a business perspective, to see kind of how those differ in the way they talk about it. Because you're right, Greg Sankey was talking about, hey, I don't know if we want to be taxed like employees if you're a player, or the whole Red Lobster private equity thing. Brett Yormark was going more towards how can we drive revenue growth and branding and all that stuff. And I think it'll be interesting to see if there's any coordination or if they kind of come together moving forward. But just in general in those comments, I also think you're going to see with this House settlement and trying to get that situated, and the NCAA is still going to be working with Congress to get antitrust exemptions and all that kind of stuff. I think they're really going to lean into, well, this settlement deal was good, but we need to focus on this and maybe kind of sit tight for a while. Whereas there's certainly going to be another faction of people that this just opens the door to collective bargaining and employment and a whole other conversation. And again, I realize we feel like we're so much talking about off the field stuff, but until we can finally get players on the field and start talking about games, I think this is going to be the dominant topic of college sports, and definitely football here for the next couple of months.
Yeah, especially, you sat through a whole press conference that was 35 minutes long the other day. And, Smokey was asking me like afterwards, cause I was, on the Zoom, and he said, well, what were the big things? I said, well, there was a lot of, long explanations for here's why we don't know, but there was not a lot of like, well, here's what we absolutely know right now. Like, we've figured this out. There were no answers on the other end of that. Like, just like, oh, we don't know. I think between Dr. Livingstone and Brett Yormark, like maybe 3 definitive answers, and it's not their fault. They don't know, but like the whole 35 minutes of 3, like, oh no, here's what we're going to do there. The rest of it was like, it's been less than a week. We have no idea.
Yeah, and that's the toughest part with the settlement is it's not finalized yet, right? So, I think they expect a lot of this stuff to go through in some form or fashion, but until they have the hard sign off, from the courts and from the judge, it's kind of tough to speak too definitively on any of this. And it is so new. And so while definitely, behind the scenes, these ADs and presidents, they're planning for the revenue sharing, they're planning for kind of this new world order. But when you're asking questions and people are on the record, I can understand the hesitancy to say definitively one way or another on certain things, because the truth is, they don't have hard answers. Same thing with like the roster limits and the Title IX stuff. Trust me, those people are genuine when they're saying, well, we're not totally sure how this is going to look, because they don't have answers yet. And so when you think about the fact that this revenue sharing and the settlement stuff could kick in next football season, 2025, but it might not get, figured out until later this late fall, or even as late as like January 2025 or something like that, there's going to be a lot of policies and new guidelines that have to get implemented on the fly and pretty quick. And so, it could be a little bit of a cluster if we get to that point.
Here's my idea. They get all the decision makers in a room, and they get attorneys there, and they throw ideas out there, and the game is, how do we not get sued? And if they throw out an idea where they're going to get sued, then everybody has to take a shot. And then 4 days later, when they come out of the coma that they're going to be in from the 50 shots they're going to have to take a day, then they'll be like, okay, here's the plan, and that'll be what we go with.
It's definitely true. And the other, funny part of that is you usually don't want to be first, right? Because if you go first, then that's what could leave you open to the lawsuit potential. And so I think for a lot of people, whether it's the private equity thing or, how you handle the revenue sharing, I think a lot of people are going to be kind of hoping that there's like a maverick out there who, throws caution to the wind and does whatever they want, and then see how that falls out from a legal perspective. Because for most people, I think they just want to be on the safer side and not get sued, like you said. And that's, I think, going to be a big topic of talk. Again, I much rather prefer talking on the field in football, and we'll certainly get there once fall arrives. But for now, it's a lot of legal talk, revenue growth talk, and all the kind of boring eat your vegetable stuff that we're going to have to deal with first.
Yeah, absolutely. Justin, thanks so much for hopping on today. Are you going to go to Vegas? Do you know yet?
I'll be in Vegas. I'm looking forward to it.
All right. Well, we'll see you in Vegas, buddy.
Absolutely.
Justin Williams of The Athletic here on 365 Sports.